Today we are going to work on creating a context document that will act as instructions for our AI project to help us format recipe cards. And for me, I like to start my workflow with the recipe card because that's the basis of everything that's going to go past that. So if I get a lot of things fleshed out during the recipe testing process, I like to capture those notes and make sure that they're recorded in my AI project. And whether or not I continue to work on that recipe in different formats like the blog post, social media captions, email, copy, whatever goes after that, I like to have it to start with the recipe card and my initial theory recipe because that is where everything starts for me. Anyway, sometimes I do a little small keyword research before I do a recipe. Sometimes I'll find a good keyword. Then I usually will write a theory recipe. Sometimes I'll look on the internet for inspiration about what are the different angles I could take that keyword. But I do not do extensive SEO analysis before writing a theory recipe because I really want it to be about the food and how bringing my own style to that food. Again, I'll look for inspiration in books or in the internet, but I don't use the AI tool to drive that very frequently. Once in a while, if I'm really stuck, I'll ask like, where could I take this? But that's the fun part to me. I don't know why. That's not the thing I want to hand off to AI. I love that. The way we're going to go through this is I'm just going to do it kind of live and messy. And I'm hoping this gives you a framework for how you could go about doing it in the future with other processes. So in this mini course, we're going to go over this recipe card formatting guide, but you could also apply this to your blog post format guide or fill in the blank, how you want emails written. So this is going to give you an example process that you hopefully can take the theory behind all of this and apply it to other processes. So I am in ChatGPT for right now. I have a project that helps me create these context documents. But for your first one, I don't think you're not necessarily going to know exactly how you want to do that. So I think it makes sense to do it in a general conversation. I have my microphone on, which I like to do text to speech with, and that's how I'm going to do this primarily. And I'm just going to go to dictate and tell it what we're going to do. Today we're going to work on a context document or a master prompt that will help inform an AI project how to take a messy recipe that I provided, form it into a theory recipe card that I will follow through recipe testing, respond to alterations or tips and tricks that I observed during the recipe testing process, then format it into a thorough, professionally written recipe that can be copied and put into my WP recipe plugin for my food blog. Okay, I've done this before where I hit the X and then I'm so irritated because that big prompt I just made is gone. The other way you can also do this is do not the ChatGPT auto dictation, whatever, but to do that FN or that globe shortcut on your keyboard. So I'm going to demonstrate that way now, just to finish off this prompt. I would like you to ask me any clarifying questions or help me provide all of the relevant information that would be necessary for this process and to thoroughly fill out a WP recipe card plugin for my food blog. And let's finish the prompt. Please ask any clarifying questions before diving into creating any documents. period. When we go to make the document, we'll be making it in a Canvas document, period. Okay, so I'm telling it what we're going to do. I tell it some of the specifications I need from it, and explaining the WP recipe card is where it's finally going, right? So I want to think about where is this going in the very end. For this is I'm copying it over to a WP recipe plugin on my blog. So I want to try to make sure I fill out all of those forms. And if you have a different plugin, you might specify that, but odds are most of them are trying to cover all the information. I believe I said, please ask clarifying questions before diving in. I tend to say, please ask clarifying questions every time in a prompt. And sometimes I do it multiple times. That is huge. That's going to make sure that we're like both on the same page before it just like dives in and makes a 2-page document that I have to read and go, this doesn't make any sense. Let's make sure we're on the same page before it goes off and does something. Okay, let's see what it's going to do. Okay, so this is what the AI spat out in terms of what we needed to clarify before we moved on. And there's a bunch of different elements. It's the plugin fields, what needs to be included, what does a theory recipe look like, and what should or shouldn't be included in that. Messy input, what that looks like, recipe testing workflow. So it's asking a lot of clarifying questions, which is exactly what I had asked it to do. So I wanted it to be really thorough about what were all the decisions I needed to make before it was going to be capable of creating instructions for the project to do what I wanted really specifically. I could move this into a Canvas document, which why don't we do that? Can you move this into a Canvas document? And we could edit in here and answer the questions in here if we want. But when I'm working on a prompt, I actually like to move it over into another document, and I'm just throwing it into a notes document here. And then I'll fill it in from there. I'm actually going to make another copy of this because I'm going to provide a copy of this in the PDF. So I'm just going to copy and paste this over. So I will give you a copy of this whole doc as is in the PDF so you can reference this in case you don't get the same output that I'm getting, which there is a chance, right? This is my ChatGPT that has made a ton of recipes with me and has gone through a lot of different iterations of this process. So if yours doesn't get the exact output yet that I'm getting, that's normal. And what you can do is copy this and ask it to alter it for you. So that can be part of your prompting process. Okay, so I want to show you here. I'm going to open to edit. We're going to go to edit. Now, what recipe card are you using? WP Tasty. One of the reasons I don't like dictating into the Canvas document is that sometimes it messes up the format, as you just saw. So for me, right, I had made that a bullet point numbered underneath that question. And for how great the Canvas document is, if you're trying to dictate large segments of answers, I find it much easier to move it over into a separate document and dictate over there. But you have to figure out what works best for you. I'm gonna bring that back, right, to where it was. Oop. So if you mess up the document and you want to head back to a version before, you can use this little guy to head back there. And you can also say, can you revert back to the last version? And so it should change that. Now, if you're just typing your answers, it's probably perfectly fine and easy for you, but I do like to dictate so much that I'm going to go. So it's asking me which version to go back to, and so I'm just going to go to A, which was the original response it had. Okay, so I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to answer a bunch of the questions. One of the things to keep in mind is I live in the US. I have a US-based audience, so my ingredient amounts are designed for that. If you have a different audience, that's where you're going to make different decisions about your recipe card. Just because this is what I do for my recipe card doesn't mean that's what you need to do for yours. Also, you might have a different system for creating your theory recipe, and it's much more meticulously done before you even get to ChatGPT. And then you might not need to have such a messy input process. And if so, you can alter those different, you really want to specify those things to your workflow. Feel free to just take mine for now, work with it, and then decide what you don't like about it. We can always come back to this context document and alter it and try to personalize it to you. So I'm going to pause, answer through some of these questions, and then I'll tell you what I did. Okay, so I just filled in which recipe card, WP Tasty. It asked me which fields I wanted that must be filled out. And I said I wanted to plan on filling out all of them except for equipment and nutrition. Nutrition will be done with a calculator, so I don't need to estimate it with the AI tool. But it did remind me right here that I want to make sure that I have a disclaimers in the notes section. Now, this is an example of a question prompting me to remember something that isn't necessarily within the time, like the logical sequence of the outline, but I want to put it down before I forget. And hopefully that we'll see if that shows up later. So now we're on to theory recipe card. What belongs in the theory recipe card? I would like to include ingredient amounts, step-by-step instructions, and an estimated timeline, period. I'd like to guess how many servings it's going to be before I actually cook it, and then we'll adjust that amount after the first test. How posh will this theory recipe be? I'm going to say almost blog ready, just so it forces me to think about what are all the details I need to include. And then it makes it really easy for me to know, oh, I should have said this in the instructions when I'm reading it for recipe testing. Almost blog ready. Please include as much relevant information as possible in the theory recipe card. Period. Once in a while, I will instruct you to leave a question mark next to an ingredient or step, indicating to myself that I need to clarify whether or not that particular element is necessary. Can you explain? Question mark. So I'm just going to keep moving my way down here. What does your message usually look like? I will voice memo, comma, or dictate my ideas about the recipe. Sometimes they are messier than others, period. And I would like you to clean up all of the relevant information that I provide verbally into a first draft of a recipe card. Theory. So I want to make sure it's a theory card. They're the same thing, but just to be clear for the AI, that's not necessarily the final version. Then we'll go back and forth. Which details? During the theory recipe draft, you do not have to ask me for every single piece of relevant information, but you could provide a list of questions that still need to be answered at the bottom of the theory recipe card for me to reference after testing. All right, so this is a great question. If something is missing, should AI make a best guess and mark it as an assumption, or ask a follow-up question first? This is great. So you need to make a distinction about which way you want this to go. I've found that it's somewhere in the middle. Sometimes the assumptions, it makes things go super fast. If you watched the video before where I was talking about roasting chickpeas, and it added some of the details in there that I definitely embedded in a bunch of other recipes but hadn't thought about on the fly when I was coming up with that spazzy recipe. So I'm going to say, ideally you would follow up with a question first. That question can also provide an example of how the AI would answer or fill in that information if it was going to make a best guess or an assumption. Okay. Now that might be something you want to change. Maybe you want it to make an assumption and you just correct it. Or maybe you don't want it to write anything unless you've been extremely explicit about it. How do you usually deliver testing notes? Okay. Likely a verbal ramble, using dictation. So that's how I would provide my updates. Yours might be a little bit more clean. The AI should change all relevant notes that are affected by my testing notes. Please be extremely thorough with extra information as necessary in the note section of the recipe card, period. Even if we do not include every detail in the final recipe card, it will help inform blog post writing after that. Oh, Zach just answered that question for me. Should any extra observations go in the recipe notes section? Yes. Should the AI maintain a multi-testing log or just the AI will maintain a different version of the recipe card in separate Canvas documents for each draft we work on. So that way, if I go back in the thread, I'll have that original theory recipe, then I'll have the updated version. If I wanted to test it again, we'd have a third version. It's just nice to have a log that way. But then when you're ready, you'll just be moving with that last version of the recipe card. Final recipe card style and voice. So we can go through all of these. All right, I keep trying to say no M dashes. Sometimes that sneaks in regardless of how many times I say that. Friendly, conversation, informational. So for me, the recipe card should be very clear, concise, and instructional. Clear, concise, and instructional. I do not want any auxiliary information in the recipe card. That should be boom. Again, that's my style. If I have any other encouraging information, that's going to be in the body of the blog post. We're going to go with numbered steps. Numbered steps for the instructions. We are not going to include the ingredient amounts in the instructions. And again, that might be something you change. That's like those specific changes everybody has to make their own decision about. How should measurements be handled? Ingredients should be delivered in US measurements. Measurement amounts should be fully spelt out, no abbreviations. Okay, so this is another section that like you should decide how you want to do this for this first round. I am not going to do this for here because I have a whole nother set of instructions for my blog post sections, and they all work in the same project. If you are going to be taking this final output of this project from this recipe testing and taking that and copying it and putting it into a new chat or using that for the outline for your recipe card, you might say that you do want those sections laid out here. I'm going to say no, but should remain minimal, yes. Edge case guardrails. Should the AI add safety doneness language automatically or only if we ask? I'm going to say only if we ask. Should health claims be avoided? Health claims should be avoided, especially in the recipe card. Even if I have something in a blog post and I'm citing it, that's going to be an issue for another context document. I'll explain how I want that handled in a different context document. If your messy notes are contradictory, how should AI handle it? Ask. I'm going to say point out the inconsistency and ask me to clarify. How should the AI behave? Should the AI always ask clarifying questions, summarize understanding, maintain version snapshot, avoid invention? Okay. AI should ask clarifying questions if there's any missing information or confusions in my instructions. The AI should not summarize all of its understanding before moving on, but it can clarify with questions and indicate when it's ready to move into the next step. Okay. Should there be strict stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 workflow, or flexible structure. Again, right now we're just building the one task, which is making the recipe card. So we're not going to worry about a strict structure, and we're just going to leave it flexible because you might be able to drop this into other things. Now, again, if you wanted this to flow into blog writing or an SEO report or competitor analysis before writing your blog post, that would be another set of instructions. And this would be maybe stage 1, and that competitor analysis would be stage 2. And so then you would give the AI instructions about how you go from one stage to the other. We're just sticking to one stage, so it doesn't need to be indicated as part of a larger system right now. Flexible structure. But we are going from a theory recipe through testing to final draft of the recipe card as the final output. Okay, so I'm going to copy this and I'm going to exit out of here because I didn't want to do it in the Canvas document. I'm going to copy my responses over and then see if it has any more clarifying questions. Oh, okay. Because we had put the responses into a Canvas document, it's responding in the Canvas document. Okay, which is fine. So normally that answer would show up down here, but what I'm going to do is say, okay, your answers were fully integrated into the Canvas document in a clear, organized Q&A format. Whenever you're ready, I can create the official recipe workflow master prompt as the new Canvas document. Okay, that is not the name I want to give this document. I'm going to call it Recipe Testing to Recipe Card Formatting Document. What are we going to call this? We're going to call this the Recipe Formatting Guide. Yes, you can make the first draft of this document in a new Canvas document, but please call it Recipe Formatting Guide. And you be sure to include the date in the title. I like to add the date to the title so that if I decide to go back and change this draft, I know what version I'm working with. And that just so if I need to make an update, I update the date, and then I know that's the newest version. Okay, so it is still, I want to make sure it's completely done before I dive into it and see what's going on. Okay, so this is the document it came up with. And I just read through all of it, and it sounds pretty good and covers a lot of the information that we tried to clarify in our dialogue back and forth in our clarification stage. Now, you would want to go through this line by line, and that's what I did. I just did on pause so you didn't have to hear me go through it. Make sure that feels appropriate for you and your blog. These are the decisions that you probably make on the fly every time you create a recipe. But a lot of this logic is just fluid for you. That's how you want to do it. And so right now you're slowing down and articulating to this AI project all of these micro decisions you make about your recipe card. Some of us are better at being consistent than others. So it is a nice personal check, regardless of having AI do it. Am I being consistent about how I format my recipe cards? And what is going to be best practice for me and my blog and my business? That might be different for you in your blog. So you need to make those decisions for yourself. I have read through this. What I'm going to do is I just copied that version over for you as well. So I will also provide this document as is as an example. If you seem like you're getting different outputs and you would like this as an example structure, you can use that to help prompt your project. Okay, I'm going to X out of that. So I have this context document now. And so what I'm going to do now is put this into a Word document. I'll put it into a Google Drive doc, and then I'm going to download it into a Word document onto my desktop and upload it as a reference document. I will show you all of that in a second. But I just want to clarify, this is pretty similar to how I've done it with other clients and other food bloggers. This prompt is a little different depending on how who I'm doing it for. But I would be explaining, I'm helping my client Sarah create these contacts documents. Please make sure that I would have to say, because my ChatGPT helps me do this with other different bloggers, be like, this is for her, this should be specified for her blog, her specifications. These standards are not going to apply to my blogs moving forward if there was a big discrepancy. So, again, my ChatGPT has had some practice doing this. So if you get slightly different outputs or you're like, oh, it's not as thorough as Nora's was, that's where these two documents will be helpful for you. So you can copy this over and start to answer all of these questions for yourself proactively when you say to the ChatGPT, this is what I'm doing today. I have some clarifying questions that I'm going to answer for you to help direct how we move forward. So if you answered all of these questions, you're going to get a lot closer to this kind of output. Also, you want to personalize this to you and your blog. Okay, so now I put this into a Google Drive doc. I'm going to download it as a Word document, drag that over to my desktop. Now I'm going to open up ChatGPT and I'm going to create a new project. So I'm going to open up that side, new project. I'm going to write test just because for me this isn't my current workflow. Maybe I'll give it a whirl and see if it's that much better, but I do like my workflow as it is. Recipe formatting. Actually, I'm not going to say recipe formatting. I'm just going to say recipe card. Now you can change the name of this later. So for right now, the only context document I'm putting in there is this recipe formatting guide. But if I then put an SOP, a standard operating procedure for drafting a blog post in here, maybe it becomes recipe to publication project. So I'm going to add a file. It's on my desktop right here. So it's uploading there. Okay, now I can X out. I can see the file here. And now I'm going to test the recipe project and see how it does. So why don't we try my weird peanut butter chickpea sandwich again, just because that analogy is working for me, or whatever example recipe is working for me. We're going to make a peanut butter chickpea sandwich. We're going to use sourdough bread, lightly toasted. Then we are going to roast the chickpeas after coating them with 2 tablespoons of olive oil, 2 tablespoons of hot honey, and we're going to roast them at 425 in an oven at 425 for 25 minutes until they are crispy and roasted. We're also going to put quick pickled cucumbers and red onions on them. We're going to quick pickle them. We're also going to add quick pickled cucumbers and red onions to the sandwich. We'll start quick pickling them before we start roasting the chickpeas, comma. After the chickpeas are roasted, we're going to smear 2 tablespoons of peanut butter on the lightly toasted sourdough bread. Add a 1/4 cup of chopped peanuts. Then layer on the roasted chickpeas and pickled cucumbers and onions. We're going to use a can of chickpeas rinsed and dried, and this should make 2 sandwiches. Okay, let's see what it does. So odds are it will ask me some clarifying questions and then make the recipe card. Okay, so when I come down here, I did not specify the amount of pickling liquid, so just added a question mark to me, which is great. Okay, so now I got to go back in there and add that. The amount of cucumber and red onion, great question. Okay, so I'm going to ask this to move it into a Canvas document, and I'm going to probably put some estimates into those slots, and I might leave the question mark there for when I actually test the recipe. Go to edit. Okay. I'm going to say so I'm going to highlight this. Oop. Sometimes Grammarly is annoying. Can we indicate that we're going to use a 1/2 cup of sliced cucumber rounds, and a quarter cup of thinly sliced red onions. So that should just change that line. Now I'm going to give it some formatting instructions here so that, and I'm going to do that over on this side. Can you make the cucumber and onion ingredients separate lines in the ingredients section of the recipe card? And for the pickling liquid, we are going to be using about a third of a cup of, half of a cup of lime juice, but please leave a question mark next to the pickling liquid so I'm sure to measure that, period. There will be no water, salt, or sugar in the pickling liquid. So I'm just responding to some of the question marks in the recipe card. And I'm doing that over here so that all of those match throughout the later section. So it did not update here, which is what I wanted to do. Can we make sure that the instruction reflect the updated changes we've just made to the ingredient notes section? Okay, so hopefully that will update that properly. So this looks pretty good for now. I like to have the question mark there as a placeholder to make sure I take care of that later. Okay, so that theory recipe card looks fine. What I would do now is copy and paste that over into a Word document on Google Drive. Ideally, I'd print that up before I tested the recipe in real life. I don't know why, for me, as much as I love digital things, I find having a printed recipe in front of me when I cook is really helpful because then I can physically cross steps off. ChatGPT can't do that yet. I like real paper. I'd do that and then I would come back to this. Or even while I'm crossing things off, I will have this conversation thread opened on my phone and I will make some alterations while I'm cooking. So that's how I'm going to demonstrate for now doing that. So I just pulled up that thread and I'm going to hit dictate. So it turned out that I needed 3/4 of a cup of lime juice for the pickling liquid for the cucumber and onion. The oven temperature was a little higher than I would have liked, and because of the honey, things got browned in a way I didn't like. So I'm going to lower the temperature for the next test to 400 degrees. I might have to increase the cooking time to 30 minutes because of that change. So I'm going to send that over and it's responding here. I will likely need to refresh this page for that to be reflected on this end. Okay, so it says something went wrong. I'm just going to refresh it. It has its response here, but it looks like it's editing it now here. Okay, so this is draft 2. And we're just going to look through here. All right, it's updated the lime juice. Okay, so I don't love that it says this is estimated by WP Taster Calculator. Actually, maybe I don't. Maybe that's great. But if you said you didn't want it to, if you didn't want it to say the WT recipe taster, maybe you would make that indicator in the Canvas document that it doesn't need to specify that it is the WP taster recipe. Okay, so now I'm going to say I did a final test of this recipe and I'm ready to go into a final and complete version of this recipe card that I can copy and paste over into WordPress. Okay, so this recipe card is looking pretty great. I'm going to come in and what I would normally do would be copy this over into a Word document and then when it's time to publish it on WordPress, I would copy this over into the plugin. Now, I came across a great little trick that some of the food bloggers I've worked with didn't know about, and I wanted to make sure I showed you because it can save a lot of time. Instead of typing or copying in every single element from here down, a bunch of these fields can be imported en masse, and then there are some fields you're going to have to put in manually, but it gets you a lot closer instead of having to fill out every field. So If I come to import from text, I'm going to copy, I'm just going to copy the whole thing for now and put it in here. Now I'm going to highlight the part that is the name, and I'm going to highlight the part that is the summary. These do not you have to put those in manually afterwards. So I'm not going to do that. And then I'm going to copy the ingredients. Now there's a funny thing that happens with that. So I'll show you that in a minute. Ingredients. If you had equipment, you could do equipment. I don't use that many interesting equipment things, so I don't worry about that often. And ingredient notes. And again, if you wanted to change that phrasing or be really specific about what your nutrition information or the nutrition disclosure says, that is not what mine says. I think mine says, I can't remember what mine says exactly, but you get the idea. You could decide exactly what you want yours to look like. Okay, so now that's going to fill a bunch of those fields out. And it doesn't look perfect, right? This says roasted chickpeas, and that's the header to this section of the ingredients, but that's not where we're going to fix it. We're going to use these values, and then we're going to change it on this page. So this is an ingredient group. So what I have to do is add an ingredient group, and then I will copy this over and make that an ingredient group, and then I'll delete that. Then I'll come in and I have to add all of these different elements, cuisine, course, and that. But it does, I don't have to type in every single one of these lines. So where it would be great if you could do a whole thing and it just filled it in with everything, this still gets us pretty far, which is great. That gets us a long way. Then I would do the nutrition calculation and all of those different elements. But I do save a lot of time that I don't have to type all this out. And then, so I'd probably still have a little bit of time I'd have to fill out, but that gets me pretty close to done. Okay, I know this was a really long video, and there's some back and forth to get this document that way. But what you'll find is now that you have all of those instructions in there, every recipe that you're formatting after this is going to go quicker and quicker. And for me, just having it formatted is great. And this is a weird recipe in terms of it broke it down into these different segments of the sandwich, which I actually really like. So if I had a salad and then there's a salad dressing, it breaks it down into that. That was not in our instructions. So if you have a lot of recipes that have those different elements, you might want to specify in that context document. That's how you want it to address ingredients like that. Or if that is not your preference, just put that preference in there. You're going to come across things that you realize you don't like. And that's where you should just create a notes document where you're like, ooh, I don't like it when it does this. I don't like it when it does that. Or, oh, that is great. I want to make sure that happens in every recipe. So I would, when you start doing this, take notes for yourself about what's working and what's not. And I would test at least 3 recipes before making a judgment call of, okay, I have to go change the context document. And then I would go back and change the context document after you've had a chance to evaluate what's working and what's not working for you. Again, kind of what I said earlier in the video, this is a method you could use for other elements of your business. You put that prompt in, tell it you need to make a context document, help clarify any decisions that need to be made about a blog formatting. And in that case, you might copy a bunch of your blog posts over, feed it into the AI, ask it to analyze it, and spit out some formatting guide based off of recipes or blog posts you already have. And then you can clarify back and forth until you get as close to what you consistently want as possible. I know that was a really long video. I hope it was helpful. Please reach out if you're having frustrations or you need some support working through this kind of process. And I would love to help you figure out how to make it work for you. But also don't worry about just trying to be messy with it for a time or two. And you'll get a better understanding of how it works once you're in it. I'm going to close out my Canvas document. And just a reminder, if this is the first time you're really interacting with it in this way, is that here's my chat. The conversation heads into this Canvas document here, and this is its own entity that I can copy and move over into a Word document. I can also move into that entity by hitting that button, and then here's the document, here is the chat. And then I can move out of that document by hitting that X button. And I believe there's 3, so it's 1, 2. Oh, is it only 2? There's a few different Canvas documents in here, one for each version of the recipe. Also, just a reminder, this chat, this conversation lives underneath this project. So I come back to this tab, or this tab. I'm in the master project for this. My context document lives in here, and those are the instructions. And this is that conversation about my peanut butter chickpea sandwich. If I don't like the name of that, I can hit those 3 buttons and say peanut butter chickpea sandwich with hot honey. That way, with hot honey. If I end up with a bunch more in here and I'm looking for that specific one, I'll be able to scan through all the recipes and find it. So I'm going to come back in here, and there it is. Now, sometimes I like to sit down and write the theory recipe for 4 or 5 recipes I'm going to test next week. And so they'll have 4 or 5 different conversations started. I have a new conversation for every recipe. I like to separate each conversation thread by the recipe I'm creating, and that helps keep ingredients clean, instructions clean, and it is much less confusion about what processes and what ingredients we're working with within that conversation. Okay, I hope that is helpful, and I will see you in the next video where we're going to talk about brand and style guides.